The first laugh came from behind me, soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant for me, loud enough that I knew it was. I kept my shoulders straight anyway, fingers tightening around the cheap clutch I'd borrowed for tonight, the fabric of my dress suddenly feeling thinner under the chandelier lights, like it couldn't quite protect me from the eyes that kept sliding in my direction. Weddings are supposed to feel warm, like something golden you step into, but this one felt sharp, like glass hidden under silk, and I realized too late that I wasn't just a guest here, I was entertainment. "Emily, right?" someone said, their voice syrupy sweet in that way that always comes before something cruel, and I turned because pretending not to hear would only make it worse, because I've spent my whole life learning that silence doesn't make people kinder. "You clean up, well," she added, her smile stretching just a little too far, her friends leaning in, waiting, watching, and I felt it, that shift in the room, like the air itself was holding its breath for what would come next. I smiled back, small, controlled, the way you do when dignity is the only thing you can still afford, and for a second I thought maybe it would end there, maybe they'd get bored, move on, forget I existed. But then the laughter came again, not behind me this time, not hidden, and someone else said something about thrift store lace and last-minute invitations, and just like that, I understood, I wasn't supposed to belong here. I could feel the heat rising to my face, the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that makes every movement feel heavier, slower, like you're walking through something thick and invisible, and I hated that they could see it, that they could feel it working on me. I told myself to breathe, to focus on the small things, the way the music drifted from the string quartet, the clink of glasses, the faint scent of roses that someone had spent too much money arranging, but none of it reached me, none of it softened the edges of the moment. "You know," the same voice continued, louder now, deliberate, "not everyone is meant for places like this." There it was, laid out clean and simple. No more pretending, no more softness, just the truth as they saw it, and for a second I considered leaving, just turning around and walking out before it got worse, before whatever fragile piece of me still standing decided to break. But my feet didn't move. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the quiet, stubborn belief that I had as much right to stand under these lights as anyone else in the room. And then something shifted. Not in me, in the room. The laughter didn't stop all at once, but it faltered, like someone had turned down the volume on everything except one presence I hadn't noticed before. I didn't turn immediately. I felt it first, the way conversations softened, the way people straightened without meaning to, the way the air itself seemed to tighten around a single point. And when I finally did look, it wasn't at the people who had been laughing at me. It was at the man who wasn't. He stood near the far end of the room like he had always been there, like the entire night had quietly rearranged itself around him without anyone noticing until it was too late to look away, and I could not explain it, but everything about him felt different from the others, not louder, not showier, just heavier, like presence instead of performance, like the kind of gravity you do not see until you feel it pulling at you. He did not smile, did not whisper, did not lean into anyone for approval, he simply watched, and somehow that was enough to make the people closest to him shift their posture, straighten their backs, lower their voices without being told. I realized then that the laughter had not stopped because they were finished, it had stopped because of him. Someone near me exhaled sharply, almost like they had been holding it in for too long, and another voice, quieter now, said his name under their breath, Victor Romano, like it was not something you said out loud unless you were sure you could handle the consequences of being heard. I had never heard that name before, but the way it moved through the room told me I should have. He was older than I expected, his hair silver at the temples, his posture steady, his suit perfectly tailored. Without trying too hard, the kind of detail that does not beg for attention but commands it anyway, and when his eyes lifted and met mine, it did not feel like being noticed, it felt like being understood in a way I had not agreed to. I looked away first. I always do. But the room did not return to normal. It could not. The people who had been laughing just moments ago suddenly found something fascinating in their drinks, in their phones, in anything that was not me, and for the first time that night, I was not the center of their amusement, I was the center of something else, something quieter, sharper, harder to define. He moved then. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, then another, and it was strange how the music seemed to fade even though I knew it had not stopped, how the clinking of glasses softened even though no one had set them down, how every small sound in the room seemed to step back to make space for him. I felt my heartbeat shift, not faster, not slower, just louder, like my body understood something my mind was still trying to catch up to. He did not look at anyone else as he walked, did not acknowledge the people who subtly moved aside to clear his path, did not offer a single word until he reached the front of the room where the microphone stood waiting for speeches that were supposed to be warm and forgettable and safe. This was none of those things. He paused there, just for a second, his hand resting lightly against the stand, and I realized every eye in the room was on him now, not because they wanted to see what he would do, but because they needed to know. And somehow, without meaning to, I took a step back, like distance could protect me from whatever was about to happen, like I could still slip out of this moment unnoticed, but it was already too late for that. Because when he finally lifted the microphone, he did not look at the bride, he did not look at the groom, he did not look at anyone except me. For a second, I thought I imagined it, the way his gaze held mine, like the rest of the room had disappeared, like there were no whispers. No laughter, no polished smiles hiding sharp edges, just that quiet, deliberate focus that made it impossible to breathe normally, and I felt it again, that strange pull, like something had already shifted and I was the last one to understand it. His fingers adjusted the microphone with a small, precise movement, no rush, no hesitation, and the soft feedback hum echoed just long enough to make every conversation in the room fall completely silent, not out of politeness, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to instinct. I could hear my own heartbeat again, steady but louder than it should have been, like it was trying to warn me or prepare me, I could not tell which. Someone near the front shifted in their chair, another cleared their throat, but no one spoke, no one interrupted, because whatever this was, it was not part of the program anymore. His voice, when it came, was not raised, not dramatic, just controlled, measured, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry, it simply reached where it needed to go. That will be enough. The words were not directed at anyone specific, but somehow they landed everywhere at once, and I saw it happen, the subtle change, shoulders tightening, eyes lowering, the people who had been so quick to speak before now suddenly unsure of where to look. He paused after that, just long enough to make the silence feel intentional, like he was giving the room a chance to understand what had just shifted, and then his gaze returned to me, steady, unwavering, as if everything that came next had already been decided. I felt my fingers loosen around my clutch without realizing it, the small click of the clasp echoing far too loudly in my own ears, and I wanted to step back again, to disappear into the edges of the room where I belonged, but something held me in place, something stronger than embarrassment or pride, something that felt dangerously close to inevitability. She stays. The words were simple, almost quiet, but they landed heavier than anything that had been said all night, heavier than the laughter, heavier than the careless remarks that had tried to shrink me into something smaller, and I saw the reaction. Ripple outward, not loud, not chaotic, just controlled tension, like no one quite knew how to respond without making a mistake. I did not understand what he meant, not fully, not yet, but I understood enough to feel the shift, to feel the way the space around me changed, the way people who had dismissed me minutes ago now avoided meeting my eyes, as if proximity alone had become something they needed to reconsider. My throat felt tight, my thoughts too slow to catch up, and before I could stop myself, before I could remember that speaking here might make everything worse, I heard my own voice, quieter than I intended but steady enough to carry. I did not ask for that. It was the wrong thing to say, or maybe it was the only thing I could say, because I needed to hold on to something that was mine, some small piece of control in a moment that felt like it was slipping away from me entirely. For the first time since he had stood, something in his expression shifted, not irritation, not amusement, something closer to acknowledgement, like he had expected that answer and approved of it without saying so. He lowered the microphone slightly, just enough that his next words felt less like an announcement and more like something meant only for me, even though the entire room could still hear it. You did not have to. And just like that, the silence returned, deeper this time, heavier, filled with questions no one dared to ask, and I realized with a clarity that settled somewhere deep in my chest that whatever this moment was, whatever he had just set in motion, it was not ending here, it was only beginning. No one clapped, no one laughed, no one even pretended this was part of the evening anymore. The kind of silence that follows something irreversible settled over the room, and I could feel it pressing against my skin, heavier than the heat of the lights, heavier than the weight of every stare that had suddenly changed direction. A minute ago, they had been looking at me like I was out of place, like I was something temporary they could dismiss, and now they looked at me like I had become something else entirely, something they needed to reassess, something they were not prepared for. I swallowed slowly, trying to steady myself, but my body was already reacting, my shoulders tightening, my breath shallow, like I had stepped into a moment that was moving faster than I could keep up with. He lowered the microphone fully this time, his hand resting at his side, the gesture simple but final, like whatever needed to be said had already been said, and nothing else would be added. The wedding coordinator near the stage hesitated, her smile frozen in place, clearly unsure whether to continue with the program or wait for permission that was not coming, and the bride, standing just a few feet away, looked confused, then uneasy, her eyes flickering between him and me as if trying to understand how the night had shifted so far from what she had planned. I should have stepped back. I should have disappeared into the crowd and let the moment dissolve without me. But I did not move. Because he was still looking at me. Not in a way that demanded anything, not in a way that pressured or cornered, but in a way that made it clear that the next step was mine, even if everything else had already been decided. My pulse echoed in my ears, steady but loud, and I forced myself to take a breath, then another, grounding myself in something real, something I could still control. You cannot just decide that, I said, my voice quieter than his had been, but it carried, it reached him, and that was enough. A few people shifted uncomfortably, as if they were waiting for him to correct me, to reassert whatever authority they believed he held over this moment, but he did not. Instead, he took a single step down from the stage, the movement unhurried, deliberate, closing the distance between us without making it feel like a chase. The closer he got, the more I noticed the details, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the calm steadiness in his expression, the complete absence of doubt, and it was that last part that unsettled me the most, not arrogance, not force, just certainty. You are right, he said, his voice lower now, meant for me but still audible in the quiet room. I do not decide for you. The words caught me off guard, not because I believed him yet, but because it was not what I expected, and for a moment, the tension shifted again, not gone, just redirected into something quieter, more dangerous in its own way. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the subtle rise and fall of his breathing, close enough that the rest of the room blurred at the edges, and then he added, just as evenly, but I decide who speaks to you like that. My chest tightened at that, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden clarity of what he meant, of what had just happened, of why the room felt different now. This was not about claiming me. Not entirely. This was about drawing a line, about shifting something invisible but undeniable, and I realized that every person who had laughed before understood it too. No one said a word. No one tried to challenge it. And for the first time that night, I was not the smallest presence in the room. I just did not know yet what I had become instead. The room did not return to normal after that, it could not, because once a line is drawn in front of everyone, you cannot pretend it was never there, and I felt it in the way people shifted around us, subtle but unmistakable, like invisible borders had been placed and no one wanted to be the one who crossed them by accident. I became aware of space again, of distance, of how no one stood too close to me anymore, not out of kindness, but out of calculation, and that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. I had spent most of my life trying not to stand out, trying to blend into the background where things were safer, simpler, predictable, but this was the opposite of that. This was being placed directly under a spotlight I did not ask for and did not know how to step out of. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay steady, to not let the moment pull me somewhere I could not control, and I lifted my chin just slightly, enough to meet his eyes again without looking away this time. You stopped them, I said, my voice quieter now, not challenging, not defensive, just trying to understand, and for a second, I wondered if that was the wrong approach, if understanding was not something he offered freely. But he did not hesitate. "No," he replied, just as calm, just as certain. "They stopped themselves." I frowned slightly at that, because it sounded like a contradiction, like something designed to sound simple while hiding something more complex underneath, and maybe he saw that, because his gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was a flicker of something there, something closer to patience than I expected. "People choose how they behave," he continued, his tone even, measured. "They only change when they understand the cost." The words settled over me slowly, heavier the longer I held onto them, and I realized he was not talking about tonight alone, he was talking about something broader, something that extended beyond this room, beyond this moment, something that explained the way everyone here reacted without being told what to do. My fingers tightened slightly around my clutch again, grounding myself in something physical as my thoughts tried to catch up. "And I am the cost?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out more honestly than I intended, because that was what it felt like I had been turned into a warning without being given a choice. This time, he paused. Not long, just enough that I noticed it, just enough that I realized my question had landed somewhere real. "No," he said finally, quieter now, but no less steady. "You are the line." I did not know what to do with that. A line. Not a consequence, not a symbol, something more defined, more deliberate, and it left me standing there with a strange mix of confusion and awareness that I could not quite separate. Around us, the wedding tried to resume, music returning hesitantly, conversations picking up in softer tones, like everyone was testing the edges of what was allowed now, but it was different, everything was different, and I knew it would not go back to the way it had been before he stood up. I glanced past him for a moment, catching the reflection of myself in the tall mirrored column near the dance floor, and for a second, I barely recognized the person staring back, not because I had changed, but because the way the room saw me had shifted, and that changed everything. When I looked back at him, he was still there, still steady, still watching, like he had all the time in the world and none of it was wasted, and I realized something else then, something quieter but just as important. He had not asked me to follow him. He had not told me to leave. He had simply stepped into my world and changed its rules. And somehow, without saying another word, he was waiting to see what I would do next. I should have walked away then, before the moment rooted itself too deeply, before whatever invisible line he drew started to feel real instead of temporary, but my feet stayed where they were, like something inside me needed to understand this before I could leave it behind. The music had returned, softer now, careful, like even the band understood they were playing in a room that had changed, and conversations restarted in fragments, broken and uneven, never quite reaching the volume they had before, as if everyone was still listening for something else to happen. I became aware of the small details again, the cold air brushing against my shoulders, the weight of the borrowed dress, the faint tremor in my hands that I forced still by tightening my grip just enough to feel it, just enough to remind myself I was still in control of something. "Why me?" I asked finally, the question quieter than anything else I had said, not meant for the room, not meant for anyone but him, because that was the part one could not reconcile, not the attention, not the silence, but the choice behind it. He did not answer right away, and for a moment I thought he might not answer at all, that this was one of those questions that would remain hanging between us, unanswered and deliberate, but then he shifted slightly, just enough to change the angle of his stance, just enough that I understood he was considering his words, not avoiding them. "Because you did not lower your eyes," he said, simple, direct, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and I blinked, caught off guard by the answer, because it felt too small to explain something this large, too simple to carry the weight of. What had just happened? "That is all?" I asked, unable to hide the disbelief in my voice, because if that was true, if that was really all it took, then everything I thought I understood about how this world worked was wrong. His expression did not change, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he held my gaze, the kind that did not need to argue its point. "Most people do," he replied, and there was no judgment in it, no criticism, just observation, and somehow that made it feel more real, more grounded, like this was not about me being different, it was about me choosing not to disappear when it would have been easier to do so. I let that settle for a moment, turning it over in my mind, trying to decide if I believed him or if I was simply looking for something to hold onto in a situation that made no sense. Around us, the reception continued in a quieter rhythm, people moving carefully, conversations contained, every glance measured, and I realized something else then, something I had not noticed at first. No one had approached me. Not to apologize, not to explain, not even to pretend nothing had happened. It was as if an invisible barrier had formed, not around him, but around me, and the realization sent a strange chill through me, not fear exactly, but awareness of how quickly things could change when power entered a space that did not belong to it before. I looked back at him, studying the details I had ignored earlier, the steadiness in his posture, the calm in his expression, the absence of any need to prove himself, and I understood something else, something quieter but sharper. He was not waiting for permission to exist in this moment. He had already decided his place in it. And now? I asked, the question coming out softer than I intended, because I needed to know where this was going, if it was going anywhere at all, or if this would end as suddenly as it had begun. For the first time, his gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but past me, toward the far end of the room where the exit doors stood closed under the soft glow of overhead lights, and when he spoke again, his voice was just as calm, just as controlled. But there was something else there now, something that felt like a choice being offered rather than a decision being made. Now, he said, you decide if you walk back into that room as they remember you, or if you leave it as they will not forget. And just like that, the moment shifted again, not louder, not sharper, just deeper, like a door had opened that I had not known was there, and for the first time since the night began, I realized that whatever happened next would not be about what he said or what they thought. It would be about what I chose to do with it. I did not answer him right away because the truth was I did not know how to, not in a way that felt honest, not in a way that did not change something I might not be ready to change, and for a moment I just stood there, caught between the version of myself I had been an hour ago and the version of myself he was quietly offering me the chance to become. The room continued around us, but it felt distant now, like a scene I was no longer fully part of, like I was watching it from just outside the frame, and I could feel their eyes again, not bold like before, not careless, but careful, measuring, waiting to see which direction I would choose. I followed his gaze toward the exit, the tall doors standing under soft light, simple, ordinary, and yet they felt like something more now, like a threshold instead of just a way out, and I realized that leaving did not just mean stepping outside, it meant stepping into something unknown, something that did not come with instructions or guarantees. And if I walk out, I said slowly, forcing the words to stay steady, what happens then? My voice did not shake, but it felt like it might, like there was too much behind it for something so simple to carry. He did not look at the doors when I asked, he looked at me, and there was no hesitation in his expression, no uncertainty, just that same quiet certainty that had unsettled me from the beginning. Then you stop asking for permission, he said, and the words landed deeper than I expected, not loud, not forceful, but precise, like they had been chosen carefully to mean exactly what they said and nothing more. I let out a small breath I did not realize I was holding, because that answer was not what I expected either, it was not a promise, not an explanation, just a shift, a different way of seeing something I had always accepted without questioning. I glanced back at the room again, really looking this time, at the people who had laughed, at the ones who had stayed silent, at the ones who now avoided looking at me altogether, and I felt something settle inside me, something quiet but firm, something that had been there before tonight but had never been given a reason to rise to the surface. I thought about how easily they had decided who I was when I walked in, how quickly they had tried to define me, reduce me, place me somewhere lower without even thinking about it, and I realized that if I stayed, if I let the night continue as if nothing had happened, then they would remember me exactly the way they had decided I was, no matter what changed in the moment. I looked back at him, at the man who had not raised his voice, who had not needed to, who had stepped into a room and altered it without asking for permission himself, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing in front of something overwhelming. I felt like I was standing at a choice. My fingers loosened around my clutch, the tension easing just enough that I could breathe fully again, and I took a step, not toward the doors, not away from him, just forward, enough to feel the ground beneath me again, enough to know I was the one moving. "You make it sound simple," I said, my voice quieter now, but clearer, steadier than it had been before, and there was a small shift in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite approval, just recognition, like he understood the weight behind the words even if I had not fully spoken it. "It is not simple," he replied, just as calm, just as certain. "It is just clear." And that was when I understood the difference, not easy, not effortless, just undeniable once you saw it, and I turned my gaze back to the doors one more time, feeling the moment settle into something real, something final, knowing that whatever I chose next would not just change how they saw me. It would change how I saw myself. I did not realize I had already made the decision until my body moved before my thoughts could catch up, one step, then another, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, like something inside me had finally aligned in a way it never had before, and the moment my heel turned away from the center of the room, I felt it, the shift, not in him, not in them, but in me. The air felt different, lighter somehow, even though nothing around me had physically changed, the music still playing, the glasses still clinking, the soft hum of conversation trying to rebuild itself behind me, but it no longer pressed against me the same way, it no longer defined the space I stood in. I did not look back right away, not because I was afraid to, but because I did not need to anymore, and that realization settled deep, quiet, but solid, like something that would not move once it found its place. I heard the faint echo of footsteps behind me, measured, unhurried, matching mine without overtaking them, and I knew without turning that he was following, not leading, not directing, just present, and somehow that mattered more than anything he had said. The doors grew closer, tall and simple, the soft light above them casting long shadows across the polished floor, and for a brief second, I caught my reflection again in the glass, but this time it did not feel distant or unfamiliar, it felt grounded, like I was finally seeing something that had always been there but had never been allowed to stand on its own. My hand lifted slightly, hesitating just inches from the handle, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because crossing this threshold meant something, even if I could not yet fully name it. "Once you walk out," his voice came from just behind me, calm, even, not interrupting, just adding to the moment, "they will tell this story differently." I paused at that, my fingers resting lightly against the cool metal, because I understood what he meant, not the details, but the weight of it, the way narratives shift depending on who holds the power to tell them, the way moments like this become something else entirely once they leave the room they were born in. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at him over my shoulder, and for the first time since this began, I noticed something I had not seen before, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the space between his words, a quiet acknowledgement that this choice was mine, entirely mine, and that whatever followed would belong to me as much as it belonged to him. "Let them," I said softly, and the word surprised me, not because they were bold, but because they were simple, unburdened, like I no longer needed to negotiate how I was perceived, like I had finally stepped out of that cycle without realizing when it happened. His gaze did not change, but there was something there, something that felt like approval without being spoken, something that did not need to be confirmed. I pressed the handle down, the door opening with a quiet ease that felt almost symbolic, like there had never really been anything holding it closed in the first place, and cool night air met me instantly, brushing against my skin, grounding me in a reality that felt wider, less contained, less defined by the walls I had just stepped away from. I took another step forward, then another, the soft echo of my heels shifting from polished floor to concrete, the sound sharper, clearer, more honest somehow, and I realized I was breathing differently now, deeper, steadier, like something that had been held tight inside me had finally been released without resistance. Behind me, the door closed gently, not slammed, not dramatic, just final, and I stood there for a moment, looking out at the quiet stretch of the parking lot, the distant glow of streetlights casting long lines across the asphalt, the world outside continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. "Emily," he said, my name steady in the night air, and I turned fully this time, not out of obligation, not out of uncertainty, but because I chose to, because I wanted to see what came next, not because I was being pulled into it, but because I was stepping into it on my own terms. I did not expect my name to sound different out here, but it did, softer somehow, not because he changed his tone, but because there was no crowd to shape it, no echo of judgment around it, just open air and the quiet hum of a world that did not know what had just happened inside those doors. I faced him fully now, the distance between us small but deliberate, not closing, not widening, just held in a way that felt intentional, like neither of us was trying to control the space, only acknowledge it. The night stretched behind him, dark and steady, the faint glow of streetlights outlining his silhouette, and for the first time since I saw him, he looked less like a force that had entered a room and more like a man standing in front of me, still composed, still certain, but no longer framed by the reactions of others. "You could have stayed," he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, just a statement, and I let the words settle for a moment before answering, because I wanted to be sure that whatever I said next belonged entirely to me. "So could you?" I replied, my voice steady, not sharp, not defensive, just clear, and there was a brief pause between us, not awkward, not tense, just real, like we were both measuring something that did not need to be spoken aloud. He inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement, and for a second, I saw something shift again, not in his control, but in his attention, like he was no longer observing a situation, but a choice that had already been made. "I do not stay where the rules are unclear," he said, and I understood that, more than I expected to, because for the first time, I realized I had been living by rules I never agreed to, expectations I never questioned, and tonight had forced me to see them for what they were. The breeze picked up slightly, brushing against my arms, grounding me again, reminding me that I was here, outside, not inside that room anymore, not inside that version of myself either, and I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension I had carried all evening finally loosen in a way that felt permanent. "And now?" I asked, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to hear how he saw this moment, how someone like him defined what came after something like that. He did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, considering, and then he spoke, just as calm as before, but with something quieter beneath it, something that felt less like control and more like respect. "Now you do not go back to being invisible," he said, and the words settled into me with a clarity that felt undeniable, not a command, not a promise, just a statement of something that had already changed whether I accepted it or not. I looked past him for a moment, at the closed doors, at the place I had walked out of, and I realized I did not feel pulled back, not even a little, not by curiosity, not by obligation, not by anything, and that told me more than anything else could have. When I looked back at him, my posture had shifted without me noticing, my shoulders no longer tight, my stance no longer guarded, and I understood that whatever this night had been, whatever he had done, it had not given me something new, it had revealed something that had been waiting underneath everything I had learned to hide. "You did not make me anything," I said quietly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was no resistance in his expression, no disagreement, just that same steady acknowledgement. "No," he replied, just as quietly. "I did not." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, grounded, complete in a way that did not need to be filled with more words, and for a moment, we simply stood there, not as someone who had been chosen and someone who had chosen, but as two people who understood exactly what had just happened without needing to define it further. I shifted my weight slightly, turning just enough to glance toward the street, toward the open stretch of road that led anywhere but back inside, and I felt something settle into place with a quiet certainty I had never experienced before. He did not reach for me. He did not step closer. He simply stood there, present, as if that was enough. And maybe it was. Because for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing in someone else's story. I felt like I had just stepped into my own.